How many times have you caught yourself thinking, why did I do that again? Why did I say something I instantly regretted? Almost everyone has had a moment when the familiar image of being a rational, self-controlled person suddenly collapsed in an instant. We like to believe we are fully in charge of our words and actions. And yet, there comes a moment when it feels as though some other force slips in and interferes with our decisions. And then we are left with a sense of bewilderment. Where did that come from? Carl Jung would say, "That was your shadow speaking." In the previous video, we began our conversation about this hidden side of the psyche, the part of ourselves we don't want to see, but which nevertheless keeps showing up. It emerges in arguments, in careless words, in those impulsive actions we later regret. We explored how the shadow is not just a pretty metaphor or a symbol from ancient myths, but a real psychological force built into the very structure of personality. It exists whether we acknowledge it or not. But here is the important part. Simply knowing that the shadow exists is not enough. You'll probably agree, knowing about a problem and actually learning how to work with it are two very different things. If we stay only at the level of theory, the shadow continues to operate from the depths, like a hidden puppeteer pulling on invisible strings. In those moments, we live as though controlled by something outside of us, when in reality it is our own psyche at work. Today we will take a step further and move from explanation to practice. We will look at the methods Jung himself suggested, examine how we can meet our shadow in real life, and what it means to integrate it into conscious awareness. And most importantly, we will see why working with the shadow is not about fighting it, not about suppressing it, and not about getting rid of it, but about entering into a slow, deliberate process of deeper understanding. I want you to approach this conversation personally. The shadow is present in every human being. And if someone insists that they don't have one, that is usually the clearest sign that their shadow is especially strong and quietly at work. Think about it. How many times have you felt an inner conflict when one part of you pulled in one direction while another part pulled the other way? How many times have you noticed that your usual explanations stopped making sense, and your reactions became too sharp, too emotional, even incomprehensible to yourself? It is in these moments that a question arises before each of us. Will we continue to run away from the shadow, pretending it does not exist? Or will we dare to look at it directly? That choice determines whether we remain trapped by unconscious reactions or begin the journey toward greater wholeness. You might ask yourself a simple question. If the shadow is something that every human being carries within them, and if it is impossible to get rid of it completely, then why even bother working with it? Wouldn't it be easier just to go on with life, ignore the unpleasant parts of ourselves, and try to hold on to the right image we show to others? At first glance, that may sound logical. But here lies the greatest trap. The things we repress, the sides of ourselves we stubbornly try to ignore, do not vanish. They remain in our psyche, alive and active, constantly searching for ways to reveal themselves. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." These words capture the essence of the shadow perfectly. Everything we bury deep inside eventually returns through our actions, through our reactions, through the circumstances we find ourselves in, through those random events that seem to repeat over and over again. Think back to moments when someone unexpectedly irritated you. Perhaps their action was small, almost insignificant, and yet inside you felt a surge of emotion that seemed too strong to explain. Very often, that is the shadow at work. We might feel anger at another person's arrogance because we do not allow ourselves to be assertive. We may despise weakness in others because we are afraid to admit our own vulnerability. We may judge someone's selfishness while inside us lives a hidden, unacknowledged desire to finally put ourselves first. The shadow also shows itself in repeating life patterns. How many people ask themselves, why do I always end up with the same kind of partner? Or, why do I keep facing the same problems, even at a new job? It feels like bad luck, like coincidence, but in reality, it is our unconscious leading us back into the same situations. And until we bring those repressed sides into awareness, the scenario keeps repeating, the circle keeps narrowing, and life starts to feel like a trap. Working with the shadow is not about removing it or turning ourselves into perfect beings. The purpose is to stop being a puppet of our own unconscious impulses. When we begin to recognize the shadow, it loses much of its hidden power. It no longer dictates our choices from the shadows of the mind, and step by step, we reclaim our freedom to choose. Integrating the shadow brings 3 essential results. First, the amount of inner conflict decreases. You no longer waste your energy fighting yourself, because you learn to acknowledge the different sides of your personality. Second, you develop a sense of inner wholeness. You become more aligned within, and you no longer need to hide entire layers of your own experience from yourself. And third, the shadow often contains an energy we were taught to see as dangerous or unwanted. But once that energy is no longer destructive and finds a healthy form of expression, it becomes a source of strength, creativity, and genuine freedom. Think about it. How many unique qualities, bold ideas, and unexpected solutions could emerge if you allowed yourself to embrace the parts you once rejected? How many opportunities are lost simply because we keep telling ourselves, "That's not for me," or "I must never be that way"? This is why working with the shadow is not a passing trend, not an abstract theory, not a fancy term from psychological literature. It is a real path, a very human path, toward ending the inner struggle and beginning to use the full potential already within you. And if you are willing, even just a little, to look in the direction of those qualities that once seemed foreign, shameful, or unacceptable, then right there begins the journey toward true wholeness. When we talk about working with the shadow, it's important to say this up front. This is not magic, not esoterica, and certainly not a universal checklist of exercises that fits everyone the same way. There is no recipe you can open in a book and apply without alteration. Working with the shadow is closer to a fine art of self-knowledge, where each person has their own path, their own discoveries, and their own difficulties. Jung emphasized many times that the process of integrating the shadow is always individual, which means each of us needs to look for the methods that truly resonate. Even so, there are several practices that prove helpful again and again, because they gradually bring what is hidden into the light of awareness. Method 1. Self-observation and projections. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." It's a simple line, but it turns our usual perspective upside down. We're used to believing the problem is out there. The neighbor is rude, the colleague is lazy, the partner isn't attentive enough. But if we look closely, we often find that what hits us the hardest is tied to the part of ourselves we have pushed away. Try recalling a moment when you suddenly flared up at someone, even though, objectively, the situation didn't warrant such intensity. Why was the emotion so strong? From a Jungian point of view, it's not chiefly about the other person. It's about you. Projection is what happens when our unconscious seeks its own reflection in the outside world. Imagine someone who learned as a child to hide any aggressive impulse because they were told to be good, polite, and easy. As an adult, that person may condemn bluntness with particular fervor, seeing rudeness everywhere. In reality, they are confronting their own repressed aggression, only now it appears in someone else's face. The first step in shadow work is learning to notice these moments. When something really gets under your skin, resist the impulse to blame. Ask yourself, why exactly did this sting me? Is there something here that resembles me? Observations like this open the door to what used to stay hidden and mark the beginning of an honest conversation with the shadow. Method 2. A shadow journal. One of the simplest and surprisingly effective tools is a journal. Call it a shadow journal or simply private notes. The essence is to record situations that stirred up shame, anger, envy, or irritation. At first glance, it may sound odd. Why revisit unpleasant moments? The strength of this practice is that, over time, patterns emerge. You start seeing the same kinds of situations repeat, the same emotions flaring again and again. Then it becomes clear. This isn't random. It's a system. For instance, maybe you notice you consistently feel envy toward people who speak their mind freely. In your journal, this will show up as a recurring theme, and you'll be able to acknowledge, yes, I want to speak freely too, but I'm afraid of being judged. Discoveries like this lay the groundwork for a more honest dialogue with yourself. A shadow journal isn't about elegance or perfect wording. It's a tool for observation, and it only works when you allow yourself complete candor. Method 3. Dream analysis. For Jung, dreams formed a special language of the unconscious. He believed that in dreams, we encounter what we pushed aside during the day. The shadow often appears as strangers, doubles, pursuers, or even as monsters. Remember, dreams are rarely to be taken literally. If you meet an aggressive figure in a dream, that doesn't predict a real conflict. More likely, it mirrors your own unacknowledged aggression. Jung wrote, "The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul." This is why he advised writing dreams down right after waking and reflecting less on the plot and more on the feelings they evoke. Perhaps you dream of falling and feel a surge of fear. That may point to a repressed sense of uncertainty. Perhaps a stranger appears who makes you uneasy. Quite possibly it is the voice of the very shadow you avoid by day. Working with dreams is a way to hear the unconscious directly, without the censor of waking reason. It demands patience, but it can become one of the deepest avenues into shadow work. Method 4. Active imagination. One of Jung's original approaches is active imagination, entering into a deliberate, conscious dialogue with the image of the shadow. This isn't a game and not mere fantasy. It's a focused inner practice. You might close your eyes and picture the shadow as a character, then let it speak. What does it have to say? What accusations or requests does it bring? It may voice things you never dared to admit. Jung described active imagination as a way of listening to inner voices usually drowned out by the ego. The point isn't to submit to the shadow, it's to learn how to converse with it. Treat this seriously, not as make-believe, but as an encounter with a real part of your own psyche. Many who try it report unexpected insights, of the kind that are hard to reach by other means. Method 5. Creative work. The shadow speaks in symbols, which is why creative practices are so helpful. Drawing, writing, music, dance. Any of these can give form to what usually remains concealed. You don't need to draw well or write properly. The process is what matters. Try, for example, composing a letter from your shadow's point of view. Let it say what you never say aloud, or sketch the shadow as you feel it. In art therapy, exercises like these are considered among the safest ways to engage repressed emotions. In this sense, working with the shadow begins with small steps. Observe, record, analyze, converse, and express. Each of these methods is simple in form, but asks for honesty and persistence. With steady practice, They open access to inner terrain that once felt out of reach. And most important, there is no need for speed. This is not about getting rid of the shadow quickly, but about the willingness, step by step, to become more truthful with yourself. Working with the shadow sounds inspiring when spoken aloud. Know yourself. Embrace your hidden sides. But the moment we begin to take this task seriously, almost without exception, we run into the first and most stubborn barrier: resistance. The psyche is designed to protect us from what feels unpleasant or threatening. And the things we have repressed for years or decades do not rush to surface willingly. Think about it for yourself. The very moment you try to honestly admit to irritation, envy, or a desire you consider wrong, an inner voice immediately interrupts. It insists, "That's not me. I'm not like that. I don't have this in me." Sound familiar? This is resistance in action. The natural defense that keeps us in the comfort zone, where we don't have to face unwelcome truths. Jung noted, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That is why resistance can feel so powerful. The unconscious does not want to be seen. It clings to its shadows, because there, in the dark, it feels safe. There's another danger too. Some people, once they've encountered their shadow, begin to use it as a blanket excuse. "Well, that's just my shadow, so it must be fine," they say, and allow themselves destructive behavior. But it's essential to remember, acknowledging the shadow does not mean blindly indulging its impulses. Jung stressed that the goal is not to hand over control to our darker sides, but to integrate them, finding constructive, responsible ways for that energy to be expressed. After all, aggression by itself is not evil. When it is conscious, it can become the energy that gives us courage, decisiveness, and the strength to protect what matters. But if we give it free rein, it can destroy us and our relationships. The same is true for the longing for freedom and independence. It can fuel creativity and boldness. But when used as a justification for selfishness or indifference, it becomes nothing more than a way to avoid responsibility. This is why the key word in shadow work is balance. We admit what we once denied, but we do not turn it into a marching order. We learn to hold the energy of the shadow in our hands and direct it toward what is useful and life-giving. Working with the shadow is not indulgence, not a license to gratify every whim or weakness. It is an ongoing process of finding a place for every part of our personality, so that none of them can control us secretly from within. And this requires maturity. It is easy to say, "That's just who I am," and use that as an excuse. It is harder, but infinitely more meaningful, to admit our contradictions and take responsibility for how we channel their power. This is why shadow work can never be a one-time exercise. It is not something you do once and then cross off your list of personal growth practices. It is a path, a lifelong path, on which we must repeatedly find equilibrium between light and dark. And in that effort lies true maturity, not denying ourselves, not idealizing ourselves, but accepting the complexity of our nature and learning to live with it. To truly grasp how the shadow operates, you don't need to dive into complicated theories. Very often, it is enough simply to look closely at your everyday life. The shadow doesn't always reveal itself in dramatic ways. It usually slips into the small, ordinary moments of our daily routine. We tend to believe our irritation or dislike is triggered by a particular person. "He drives me crazy. She gets on my nerves. It's their fault." But if we pause and look a little deeper, we often discover that the real source is not out there in the external world, but in something within us, something we resist acknowledging. Carl Jung once wrote, "The shadow is that person you would rather not be." This short statement perfectly explains why we so often notice in others the very qualities we deny in ourselves. Let's take an example. Imagine someone who constantly feels anger toward lazy people. It irritates him to see others relaxing, sitting with a book, watching a movie, or simply doing nothing. To him, such people seem irresponsible, wasting time, unworthy of respect. But if we look closer, we might realize that this man never allows himself a break. He pushes himself forward relentlessly, works to the point of exhaustion, and denies himself the right to rest. His anger at laziness is really a projection of his own repressed need for rest. Deep down, he envies those who can relax, because he himself cannot give that permission to his own body and mind. Another example is just as revealing. Someone despises people who are rude or pushy. He scorns their bluntness, their assertiveness, their ability to stand up for themselves. Yet behind this hatred lies his own unacknowledged aggression. Deep inside, he too wishes he could sometimes be firm, say no, or defend his boundaries. But because that quality was repressed, perhaps long ago in childhood, when he was taught to be good and obedient, he now notices it only in others. And the more he rejects this side of himself, the stronger it appears in the outside world, provoking his anger and judgment. We could list dozens of similar stories. The person who cannot stand selfishness is often someone who sacrifices themselves constantly, neglecting their own needs while secretly envying those who can put themselves first. The one who despises weakness in others may be terrified of admitting their own vulnerability. The one who condemns greed often hides a fear of acknowledging their own desires. The crucial point is to recognize the pattern. What we judge most harshly in others often reflects the very qualities of our own shadow. And here is where a real shift can occur. Once you begin to notice these mechanisms, your perspective changes. Instead of wasting endless energy fighting other people's flaws, you start to see the connection to your own inner world. Irritation stops being just an external reaction. It becomes a message, a signpost saying, "Look here." This is part of you Jung called this projection, and his words remain strikingly relevant. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. In other words, everything we refuse to recognize in ourselves will keep reappearing in the faces, actions, and circumstances around us. And this is where the path to freedom begins. Because once the shadow is made conscious, it no longer rules us from the dark. It no longer dictates our reactions from the depths of the unconscious. Instead, it becomes a visible, integrated part of our whole personality. And in that moment, we stop being slaves to our projections, begin to see reality more clearly, and take the first real step toward freedom. Working with a shadow is not something you can do once. Check off your list of personal growth practices and be done with it. It isn't a quick evening exercise or a trendy technique you pull from a self-help book. In truth, it's a path that accompanies us throughout our entire lives. Every time we face inner contradictions, every time irritation bursts out unexpectedly, or we do something we immediately regret, that is the moment when we are given another chance to come closer to understanding our own shadow. And the more we learn about it, the less power it holds over us from the depths of the unconscious. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." This means that the longer we ignore our darker sides, the more often they will return to us in the form of repeating life scenarios, accidental mistakes, or strange and puzzling circumstances. But the very moment we begin to notice these patterns, the script of our life starts to change. Think about it. How often have you felt as though you were acting on autopilot? as if someone else inside you was pulling the strings, and afterward you caught yourself wondering, why did I do that? When we become conscious of the shadow, it stops being that secret puppeteer. It becomes a voice, one we can actually hear, understand, and weave into the greater harmony of our personality. And while this process isn't always easy, sometimes it stirs resistance, shame, or even fear. It is precisely what leads us toward a deeper sense of wholeness and inner freedom. It is important to remember, no one ever rids themselves of the shadow completely. It will always remain part of our psyche, and there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, there is wisdom in it. The shadow reminds us that we are living, contradictory, imperfect, and yet whole beings. Jung put it clearly, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. True maturity is not about cutting off everything dark, but about learning to live in peace with all sides of ourselves. When you stop running from your shadow, you stop running from yourself. And that, perhaps, is the most essential step toward freedom. From here, the journey continues. In the next video, we'll take a broader look at Jung's vision of the psyche as a whole, the layers it consists of, the ways in which the conscious and the unconscious interact, and where exactly the shadow finds its place within this system. This perspective will show us that the shadow is just one piece of a vast inner landscape. Beyond it lie other archetypes, persona, anima, and animus, the self. And understanding how they interconnect will give us an even deeper insight into who we are and what forces shape our lives.